D. Death. Mort. The term death occurs in various contexts in Lacan's work. 1. Death is constitutive of the symbolic order because the symbol, by standing in place of the thing which it symbolizes, is equivalent to the death of the thing. The symbol is the murder of the thing. Also, the first symbol in human history is the tomb. It is only by virtue of the signifier that man has access to and can conceive of his own death. It is in the signifier, and insofar as the subject articulates the signifying chain, that he comes up against the fact that he may disappear from the chain of what he is. The signifier also puts the subject beyond death because the signifier already considers him dead. By nature, it immortalizes him. Death in the symbolic order is related to the death of the father. In other words, the murder of the father of the horde in Totem and Taboo. Freud. The symbolic father is always a dead father. 2. In the seminar of 1959-1960, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Lacan talks about the second death, a phrase which he coins in reference to a passage from the Marquis de Sade's novel Juliette, in which one of the characters speaks of a second life. See Sade. The first death is the psychical death of the body, a death which ends one human life but which does not put an end to the cycles of corruption and regeneration. The second death is that which prevents the regeneration of the dead body, the point at which the very cycles of the transformations of nature are annihilated. The concept of the second death is used by Lacan to formulate ideas on various themes. Beauty. It is the function of beauty to reveal man's relationship to his own death, the direct relationship to being, and the sadistic fantasy of inflicting perpetual pain. The phrase zone between two deaths, l'espace de l'entre-deux morts, which was originally coined by one of Lacan's students, is taken up by Lacan to designate the zone in which tragedy is played out. 3. Death plays an important role in the philosophical systems of Hegel and Heidegger, and Lacan draws on both of these in his theorization of the role of death in psychoanalysis. From Hegel via Kojève, Lacan takes the idea that death is both constitutive of man's freedom and the absolute master. Death plays a crucial part in the Hegelian dialectic of the master and the slave, where it is intimately linked with desire, since the master only affirms himself or others by means of a desire for death. From Heidegger, Lacan takes the idea that human existence only takes on meaning by virtue of the finite limit set by death, so that the human subject is properly a being for death. This corresponds to Lacan's view that the analysant should come via the analytic process to assume his own mortality. 4. In his comparison between psychoanalytic treatment and the game of bridge, Lacan describes the analyst as playing the position of the dummy, in French le mort, literally the dead person. The analyst intervenes concretely in the dialectic of analysis by pretending that he is dead. He makes death present. The analyst cadaverizes himself, se corpsifia. 5. The question which constitutes the structure of obsessional neurosis concerns death. It is the question, am I dead or alive? Death drive. Pulsion de mort. Although intimations of the concept of the death drive, Todestrieb, can be found early on in Freud's work, it was only in Beyond the Pleasure Principle that the concept was fully articulated. In his work, Freud established the fundamental opposition between life drives, eros, conceived of as a tendency towards cohesion and unity, and the death drives, which operate in the opposite direction, undoing connections and destroying things. However, the life drives and the death drives are never found in a pure state, but always mixed, fused together in different proportions. Indeed, Freud argued that were it not for this fusion with erotism, the death drive would elude our perception, since in itself it is silent. The concept of the death drive was one of the most controversial concepts introduced by Freud, and many of his disciples rejected it, regarding it as mere poetry or as an unjustifiable incursion into metaphysics. but Freud continued to reaffirm the concept for the rest of his life. Of the non-Lacanian schools of psychoanalytic theory, only Kleinian psychoanalysis takes the concept seriously. Lacan follows Freud in reaffirming the concept of the death drive as central to psychoanalysis. To ignore the death instinct in Freud's doctrine is to misunderstand that doctrine entirely. In Lacan's first remarks on the death drive in 1938, he describes it as a nostalgia for a lost harmony, a desire to return to the pre-Oedipal fusion with the mother's breast, the loss of which is marked on the psyche in the weaning complex. In 1946, he links the death drive to the suicidal tendency of narcissism. By linking the death drive with the pre-Oedipal phase and with narcissism, these early remarks would place the death drive in what Lacan later comes to call the imaginary order. However, when Lacan begins to develop his concept of the three orders of imaginary, symbolic and real, in the 1950s he does not situate the death drive in the imaginary but in the symbolic. In the seminar of 1954-1955, for example, he argues that the death drive is simply the fundamental tendency of the symbolic order to produce repetition. The death instinct is only the mask of the symbolic order. This shift also marks a difference with Freud, for whom the death drive was closely bound up with biology, representing the fundamental tendency of every living thing to return to an inorganic state. By situating the death drive firmly in the symbolic, Lacan articulates it with culture rather than nature. He states that the death drive is not a question of biology and must be distinguished from the biological instinct to return to the inanimate. Another difference between Lacan's concept of the death drive and Freud's emerges in 1964. Freud opposed the death drive to the sexual drives, but now Lacan argues that the death drive is not a separate drive, but is in fact an aspect of every drive. The distinction between the life drive and the death drive is true in as much as it manifests two aspects of the drive. Hence Lacan writes that every drive is virtually a death drive because 1. Every drive pursues its own extinction. 2. Every drive involves the subject in repetition. And 3. Every drive is an attempt to go beyond the pleasure principle to the realm of excess, jouissance, where enjoyment is experienced as suffering. Defense. From his earliest works, Freud situated the concept of defense at the heart of his theory of neurosis. Defense refers to the reaction of the ego to certain interior stimuli which the ego perceives as dangerous. Although Freud later came to argue that there were different mechanisms of defense in addition to repression, he makes it clear that repression is unique in the sense that it is constitutive of the unconscious. Anna Freud attempted to classify some of these mechanisms in her book The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense of 1936. Lacan is very critical of the way in which Anna Freud and ego psychology interpret the concept of defense. He argues that they confuse the concept of defense with the concept of resistance. For this reason, Lacan urges caution when discussing the concept of defense and prefers not to center his concept of psychoanalytic treatment around it. When he does discuss defense, he opposes it to resistance, whereas resistances are transitory imaginary responses to intrusions of the symbolic and are on the side of the object. Defenses are more permanent symbolic structures of subjectivity, which Lacan usually calls fantasy rather than defense. This way of distinguishing between resistance and defense is quite different from that of other schools of psychoanalysis, which, if they have distinguished between defense and resistance at all, have generally tended to regard defenses as transitory phenomena and resistances as more stable. The opposition between desire and defense is for Lacan a dialectical one. Thus he argues in 1960 that, like the neurotic, the pervert defends himself in his desire, since desire is a defense, a prohibition, against going beyond a certain limit in jouissance. In 1964 he goes on to argue to desire involves a defensive phase that makes it identical with not wanting to desire. Delusion, délire. Delusions are usually defined in psychiatry as firmly held, incorrigible false beliefs inconsistent with the information available and with the beliefs of the subject's social group. See American Psychiatric Association. Huge. Hugues. Delusions are the central clinical feature of paranoia and can range from single ideas to complex networks of belief, called delusional systems. In Lacanian terms, the paranoiac lacks the name of the father, and the delusion is the paranoiac's attempt to fill the hole left in his symbolic universe by the absence of this primordial signifier. Thus, the delusion is not the illness of paranoia itself, it is, on the contrary, the paranoiac's attempt to heal himself, to pull himself out of the breakdown of the symbolic universe by means of a substitute formation. As Freud commented in his work on Schreber, what we take to be the pathological production, the delusional formation, is in reality the attempt at recovery, the reconstruction. Lacan insists on the significance of the delusion and stresses the importance of attending closely to the psychotic patient's own account of his delusion. The delusion is a form of discourse and must therefore be understood as a field of signification that has organized a certain signifier. For this reason, all delusional phenomena are clarified in reference to the functions and structure of speech. The paranoid delusional construction may take many forms. One common form, the delusion of persecution, revolves around the big other of the big other, a hidden subject who pulls the strings of the big other, the symbolic order, and who controls our thoughts, conspires against us, watches us, etc. Demande. The French term demander and demande lack the connotations of imperativeness and urgency conveyed by the English word demand, and are perhaps closer to the English words ask for and request. However, all English translations of Lacan use the term demand in order to maintain consistency. Although the term demand only begins to figure prominently in Lacan's work from 1958 on, related themes are already present in the 1956-1957 seminar. It is in this seminar that Lacan discusses the call, l'appel, the baby's cry to the mother. Lacan argues that this cry, cri, is not merely an instinctual signal, but is inserted in a synchronic world of cries organized in a symbolic system. In other words, the infant's screams become organized in a linguistic structure long before the child is capable of articulating recognizable words. It is the symbolic nature of the infant's screams which forms the kernel of Lacan's concept of demand, which Lacan introduces in 1958 in the context of his distinction between need, demand, and desire. Lacan argues that since the infant is incapable of performing the specific actions that would satisfy its biological needs, it must articulate those needs in vocal form, demand, so that another, the mother, will perform the specific action instead. The primary example of such a biological need is hunger, which the child articulates in a scream, a demand, so that the mother will feed it. However, because the object which satisfies the child's need is provided by another, it takes on the added significance of being a proof of the big other's love. Accordingly, demand too acquires a double function. In addition to articulating a need, it also becomes a demand for love. And just as the symbolic function of the object as a proof of love overshadows its real function as that which satisfies a need, so too the symbolic dimension of demand as a demand for love eclipses its real function as an articulation of need. It is this double function which gives birth to desire, since while the needs which demand articulates may be satisfied, the craving for love is unconditional and insatiable, and hence persists as a leftover even after the need have been satisfied. This leftover constitutes desire. Demand is thus ultimately linked to the human subject's initial helplessness. By forcing the analysand to express himself entirely in speech, the psychoanalytic situation puts him back in the position of the helpless infant, thus encouraging regression. Through the mediation of the demand, the whole past opens up right down to early infancy. The subject has never done anything other than demand, he could not have survived otherwise, and we just follow on from there. However, while the speech of the analysant is itself already a demand for a reply, this demand is underpinned by deeper demands to be cured, to be revealed to himself, to become an analyst. The question of how the analyst engages with these demands is crucial. Certainly the analyst does not attempt to gratify the analysant's demands, but nor is it simply a question of frustrating them. See frustration. In 1961, Lacan rethinks the various stages of libidinal organization as forms of demand. The oral stage is constituted by a demand to be fed, which is a demand made by the subject. In the anal stage, on the other hand, it is not a question of the subject's demand, but the demand of the big other, the parent who disciplines the child in potty training. In both of these pregenital stages, the satisfaction of demand eclipses desire. Only in the genital stage does desire come to be fully constituted. Desire, désir. Lacan's term désir is a term used in the French translations of Freud to translate Freud's term Wunsch, which is translated as wish by Strachey in the Standard Edition. Hence, English translators of Lacan are faced with the dilemma: should they translate désir by wish, which is closer to Freud's Wunsch, or should they translate it as desire, which is closer to the French term but which lacks the allusion to Freud? All of Lacan's English translators have opted for the latter, since the English term desire conveys, like the French term, the implication of a continuous force, which is essential to Lacan's concept. The English term also carries with it the same allusions to Hegel's Begierde as are carried by the French term, and thus retains the philosophical nuances which are so essential to Lacan's concept of desire, and which make it a category far wider and more abstract than any employed by Freud himself. If there is any concept which can claim to be the very center of Lacan's thought, it is the concept of desire. Lacan follows Spinoza in arguing that desire is the essence of man. Desire is simultaneously the heart of human existence and the central concern of psychoanalysis. However, when Lacan talks about desire, it is not any kind of desire he is referring to, but always unconscious desire. This is not because Lacan sees conscious desire as unimportant, but simply because it is unconscious desire that forms the central concern of psychoanalysis. Unconscious desire is entirely sexual. The motifs of the unconscious are limited to sexual desire. The other great generic desire, that of hunger, is not represented. The aim of psychoanalytic treatment is to lead the analysant to recognize the truth about his desire. However, it is only possible to recognize one's desire when it is articulated in speech. It is only once it is formulated, named in the presence of the other, that desire, whatever it is recognized in the full sense of the term. Hence, in psychoanalysis, what's important is to teach the subject to name, to articulate, to bring this desire into existence. However, it is not a question of seeking a new means of expression for a given desire, for this would imply an expressionist theory of language. On the contrary, by articulating desire in speech, the analysant brings it into existence. That the subject should come to recognize and to name his desire, that is the efficacious action of analysis. But it isn't a question of recognizing something which would be entirely given. In naming it, the subject brings forth a new presence in the world. However, there is a limit to how far desire can be articulated in speech because of a fundamental incompatibility between desire and speech. It is this incompatibility which explains the irreducibility of the unconscious. In other words, the fact that the unconscious is not that which is not known, but that which cannot be known. Although the truth about desire is present to some degree in all speech, speech can never articulate the whole truth about desire. Whenever speech attempts to articulate desire, there is always a leftover, a surplus, which exceeds speech. One of Lacan's most important criticisms of the psychoanalytic theories of his day was that they tended to confuse the concept of desire with the related concepts of demand and need. In opposition to this tendency, Lacan insists on distinguishing between these three concepts. This distinction begins to emerge in his work in 1957. but only crystallizes in 1958. Need is a purely biological instinct, an appetite which emerges according to the requirements of the organism and which abates completely, even if only temporarily, when satisfied. The human subject, being born in a state of helplessness, is unable to satisfy its own needs, and hence depends on the big other to help it satisfy them. In order to get the other's help, the big other's help, the infant must express its needs vocally. Need must be articulated in demand. The primitive demands of the infant may only be inarticulate screams, but they serve to bring the big other to minister to the infant's needs. However, the presence of the big other soon acquires an importance in itself, an importance that goes beyond the satisfaction of need, since this presence symbolizes the big other's love. Hence, demand soon takes on a double function, serving both as an articulation of need and as a demand for love. However, whereas the big other can provide the objects which the subject requires to satisfy his needs, the big other cannot provide that unconditional love which the subject craves. Hence, even after the needs which were articulated in demand have been satisfied, the other aspect of demand, the craving for love, remains unsatisfied, and this leftover is desire. Desire is neither the appetite for satisfaction nor the demand for love, but the difference that results from the subtraction of the first from the second. Desire is thus the surplus produced by the articulation of need in demand. Desire begins to take shape in the margin in which demand becomes separated from need. Unlike a need which can be satisfied and which then ceases to motivate the subject until another need arises, desire can never be satisfied. It is constant in its pressure and eternal. The realization of desire does not consist in being fulfilled, but in the reproduction of desire as such. Lacan's distinction between need and desire, which lifts the concept of desire completely out of the realm of biology, is strongly reminiscent of Kojèv's distinction between animal and human desire. Desire is shown to be distinctively human when it is directed either toward another desire or to an object which is perfectly useless from the biological point of view. Kojèv. It is important to distinguish between desire and the drives, although they both belong to the field of the big other as opposed to love. Desire is one, whereas the drives are many. In other words, the drive are the particular partial manifestations of a single force called desire, although there may also be desires which are not manifested in the drives. There is only one object of desire, object PTA, and this is represented by a variety of partial objects in different partial drives. The object PTA is not the object towards which desire tends, but a cause of desire. Desire is not a relation to an object, but a relation to a lack. One of Lacan's most oft repeated formulas is man's desire is a desire of the big other. This can be understood in many complementary ways, of which the following are the most important. 1. Desire is essentially desire of the big other's desire, which means both desire to be the object of another's desire and desire for recognition by another. Lacan takes this idea from Hegel via Kojèv, who states, desire is human only if the one desires not the body but the desire of the big other, the desire of the small other. That is to say, if he wants to be desired or loved, or rather recognized in his human value. In other words, all human anthropogenetic desire is finally a function of the desire for recognition. Kojèv. Kojèv goes on to argue, still following Hegel, that in order to achieve the desired recognition, the subject must risk his own life in a struggle for pure prestige. See Master. That desire is essentially desire to be the object of another's desire is clearly illustrated in the first time of the Oedipus complex, when the subject desires to be the phallus for the mother. 2. It is qua big other that the subject desires, that is, the subject desires from the point of view of another. The effect of this is that the object of man's desire is essentially an object desired by someone else. What makes an object desirable is not any intrinsic quality of the thing in itself, but simply the fact that it is desired by another. The desire of the big other is thus what makes objects equivalent and exchangeable. This tends to diminish the special significance of any one particular object, but at the same time it brings into view the existence of objects without number. This idea too is taken from Kojève's reading of Hegel. Kojève argues that desire directed towards a natural object is human only to the extent that it is mediated by the desire of another directed towards the same object. It is human to desire what others desire because they desire it, Kojève. The reason for this goes back to the former point about human desire being desire for recognition. By desiring that which another desires, I can make the other recognize my right to possess that object and thus make the other recognize my superiority over him, Kojève. This universal feature of desire is especially evident in hysteria. The hysteric is one who sustains another person's desire, converts another's desire into her own. For example, Dora desires Frau K because she identifies with Herr K, thus appropriating his perceived desire. Hence, what is important in the analysis of a hysteric is not to find out the object of her desire, but to discover the place from which she desires, the subject with whom she identifies. 3. Desire is desire for the big other, playing on the ambiguity of the French preposition the. The fundamental desire is the incestuous desire for the mother, the primordial big other. For desire is always the desire for something else, since it is impossible to desire what one already has. The object of desire is continually deferred, which is why desire is a metonymy. 5. Desire emerges originally in the field of the big other, in other words, in the unconscious. The most important points to emerge from Lacan's phrase is that desire is a social product. Desire is not the private affair it appears to be, but is always constituted in a dialectical relationship with the perceived desires of other subjects. The first person to occupy the place of the big other is the mother, and at first the child is at mercy of her desire. It is only when the father articulates desire with the law by castrating the mother that the subject is freed from the subjection to the whims of the mother's desire. See castration complex. Desire of the analyst. Désir de l'analyste. The phrase "the desire of the analyst" is an ambiguous one that seems to oscillate in Lacan's work between two meanings. A desire attributed to the analyst, as well as attributing knowledge to the analyst, so also the analysant attributes desire to the analyst. The analyst is therefore not only a subject supposed to know, but also a subject supposed to desire. Thus the phrase "the analyst's desire" does not refer the real desire in the analyst's psyche, but to the desire which the analysant attributes to him. The task of the analyst throughout the treatment is to make it impossible for the analysant to be sure that he knows what the analyst wants from him. The analyst must make sure that his desire remains an X for the analysant. In this way, the analyst's supposed desire becomes the driving force of the analytic process, since it keeps the analysant working, trying to discover what the analyst wants from him. The desire of the analyst is ultimately that which operates in psychoanalysis. By presenting the analysant with an enigmatic desire, the analyst occupies the position of the big other, of whom the subject asks, "Que voi?" What do you want from me? With the result that the subject's fundamental fantasy emerges in the transference. A desire proper to the analyst. The other sense of the phrase "the desire of the analyst" refers to the desire which must animate the analyst in the way he directs treatment. This is easier to define negatively than positively. It is certainly not a desire for the impossible, nor is it a desire to do good or to cure. On the contrary, it is a non-desire to cure. It is not a desire that the analysant identify with the analyst's desire. tends in a direction that is the exact opposite of identification. Rather than identification, the analyst desires that the analysand's own unique truth emerge in the treatment, a truth that is absolutely different to that of the analyst. The analyst's desire is thus a desire to obtain absolute difference. It is in the sense of a desire proper to the analyst that Lacan wishes to locate the question of the analyst's desire at the heart of the ethics of psychoanalysis. How is it that the analyst comes to be guided by the desire which is proper to his function? According to Lacan, this can only occur by means of a training analysis. The essential requirement, a condition sine qua non for becoming an analyst, is to undergo analytic treatment oneself. In the course of this treatment, there will be a mutation in the economy of desire in the analyst to be. His desire will be restructured, reorganized. Only if this happens will he be able to function properly as an analyst. Development. Psychoanalysis is presented by ego psychology as a form of developmental psychology, with the emphasis placed on the temporal development of the child's sexuality. According to this interpretation, Freud shows how the child progresses through the various pregenital stages, the oral and anal stages, to maturity in the genital stage. In his early work, Lacan seems to accept this developmental reading of Freud, which he labels geneticism, at least in the matter of a genetic order for the three family complexes and for ego defenses. As late as 1950, he takes seriously such genetic concepts as objectal fixation and stagnation of development. However, in the early 1950s, he begins to become extremely critical of geneticism for various reasons. Firstly, it presupposes a natural order for sexual development and takes no account of the symbolic articulation of human sexuality, thus ignoring the fundamental differences between drives and instincts. Secondly, it is based on a linear concept of time which is completely at odds with the psychoanalytic theory of time. Finally, it assumes that the final synthesis of sexuality is both possible and normal, whereas for Lacan no such synthesis exists. Thus, while both ego psychology and object relations theory propose the concept of a final stage of psychosexual development in which the subject attains a mature relation with the object described as a genital relation, this is totally rejected by Lacan. Lacan argues that such a state of final wholeness and maturity is not possible because the subject is irremediably split and the metonymy of desire is unstoppable. Furthermore, Lacan points out that the object which corresponds to an advanced stage of instinctual maturity is a rediscovered object. The so-called final stage of maturity is nothing more than the encounter with the object of the first satisfactions of the child. Lacan disputes the geneticist reading of Freud, describing it as a mythology of instinctual maturation. He argues that the various stages analyzed by Freud, oral, anal, and genital, are not observable biological phenomena which develop naturally, such as the stages of sensorio-motor development, but obviously more complex structures. The pregenital stages are not chronologically ordered moments of a child's development, but essentially timeless structures which are projected retroactively onto the past. They are ordered in the retroaction of the Oedipus complex. Lacan thus dismisses all attempts to draw empirical evidence for the sequence of psychosexual stages by means of the so-called direct observation of the child, and places the emphasis on the reconstruction of such stages in the analysis of adults. It is by starting with the experience of the adult that we must grapple retrospectively, nachträglich, with the supposedly original experiences. In 1961, the pregenital stages are conceived by Lacan as forms of demand. The complex relationship between the chronological emergence of phenomena and the logical sequence of structures is also illustrated by reference to the question of language acquisition. On the one hand, psycholinguistics has discovered a natural order of development in which the infant progresses through a sequence of biologically predetermined stages: babbling, followed by phoneme acquisition, then isolated words, and then sentences of increasing complexity. Lacan, however, however, is not interested in this chronological sequence since it only deals with the emergence, properly speaking, of a phenomenon. What interests Lacan is not the phenomena, external appearance of language, but the way language positions the subject in a symbolic structure. In respect of the latter, Lacan points out that the child already has an initial appreciation of the symbolism of language well before he can speak, well before the exteriorized appearance of language. However, the question of how this initial appreciation of the symbolic comes about is almost impossible to theorize, since it is not a question of a gradual acquisition of one signifier after another, but the all-or-nothing entry into a universe of signifiers. A signifier is only a signifier by virtue of its relation to other signifiers and so cannot be acquired in isolation. Thus the transition to the symbolic is always a question of creation ex nihilo, a radical discontinuity between one order and another, and never a question of a gradual evolution. The last term is particularly distasteful for Lacan, who warns his students to beware of that register of thought known as evolutionism, and prefers to describe psychic change in terms of metaphors of creation ex nihilo. Lacan's opposition to notions of development and evolution are not based on an opposition to the notion of psychic change in itself. On the contrary, Lacan insists on the historicity of the psyche and sees the restoration of fluidity and movement to the psyche as the aim of psychoanalytic treatment. His opposition to the concept of development only reflects his suspicion of all normative models of psychic change. The subject is involved in a continual process of becoming, but this process is threatened, not aided, by imposing a fixed providential model of genetic development upon it. Lacan thus argues that in psychoanalysis, history is a dimension different to that of development, and that it is an aberration to try to reduce the former to the latter. History only proceeds out of beat with development. What, then, is to be made of the two great stages which dominate Lacan's teaching, the mirror stage and the Oedipus complex? The mirror stage is clearly related to an event which can be located in a specific time in the life of the child between 6 to 18 months, but this event is only of interest to Lacan because it illustrates the essentially timeless structure of the dual relationship, and it is this structure that constitutes the heart of the mirror stage. It is interesting to note that the French term state can be understood in both temporal and in spatial terms, as a stage or as a stadium. Likewise, while Freud locates the Oedipus complex at a specific age, the 3rd to the 5th year of life, Lacan conceives of the Oedipus complex as a timeless triangular structure of subjectivity. It follows that questions of exactly when the ego is constituted or when the child enters the Oedipus complex, which have led to so much controversy between other schools of psychoanalysis, are of little interest to Lacan. While Lacan admits that the ego is constituted at a specific moment in the history of the subject and that there is a moment when the Oedipus complex is formed, he is not interested in the question of exactly when those moments occur. The question of when the child makes his entry into the symbolic order is irrelevant to psychoanalysis. All that matters is that before he does so, he is incapable of speech and so inaccessible to psychoanalysis, and that after he does so, everything prior to that moment is transformed retroactively by the symbolic system. Dialectic. The term dialectic originated with the Greeks, for whom it denoted, among other things, a discursive procedure in which an opponent in a debate is questioned in such a way as to bring out the contradictions in his discourse. This is the tactic which Plato ascribes to Socrates, who is shown as beginning most dialogues by first reducing his interlocutor to a state of confusion and helplessness. Lacan compares this to the first stage of psychoanalytic treatment, when the analyst forces the analysand to confront the contradictions and gaps in his narrative. However, just as Socrates then proceeds to draw out the truth from the confused statements of his interlocutor, so also the analyst proceeds to draw out the truth from the analysand's free associations. Thus, Lacan argues that psychoanalysis is a dialectical experience, since the analyst must engage the analysant in a dialectical operation. It is only by means of an endless dialectical process that the analyst can subvert the ego's disabling illusions of permanence and stability, in a manner identical to the Socratic dialogue. Although the origin of dialectics goes back to the Greek philosophers, its dominance in modern philosophy is due to the revival of the concept in the 18th century by the post-Kantian idealists Fichte and Hegel, who conceived of the dialectic as a triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. For Hegel, the dialectic is both a method of exposition and the structure of historical progress itself. Thus, in Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807, Hegel shows how consciousness progresses towards absolute knowledge by means of a series of confrontations between opposing elements. Each confrontation is resolved by an operation called the Aufhebung, usually translated as sublation, in which a new idea, the synthesis, is born from the opposition between thesis and antithesis. The synthesis simultaneously annuls, preserves, and raises this opposition to a higher level. The particular way in which the Hegelian dialectic is appropriated by Lacan owes much to Alexandra Kojève, whose lectures on Hegel Lacan attended in Paris in the 1930s. Following Kojève, Lacan puts great emphasis on the particular stage of the dialectic in which the master confronts the slave, and on the way that desire is constituted dialectically by a relationship with the desire of the big other. Using the Dora case to illustrate his point, Lacan shows how psychoanalytic treatment progresses towards truth by a series of dialectical reversals. Lacan also makes use of the concept of Aufhebung to show how the symbolic order can simultaneously annul, preserve, and raise an imaginary object, the imaginary phallus, to the status of a signifier, the symbolic phallus. The phallus then becomes the signifier of this Aufhebung itself, which it inaugurates by its disappearance. However, there are also important differences between the Lacanian dialectic and the Hegelian dialectic. For Lacan, there is no such thing as a final synthesis such as is represented by Hegel's concept of absolute knowledge. The irreducibility of the unconscious represents the impossibility of any such absolute knowledge. For Lacan, then, the Aufhebung is one of those sweet dreams of philosophy. This denial of a final synthesis subverts the very concept of progress itself. Thus Lacan contrasts his own version of the Aufhebung with that of Hegel, arguing that it replaces Hegel's idea of progress with the avatars of a lack. Disavowal, déni. Freud uses the term Verleugnung to denote a specific mode of defense which consists in the subject's refusing to recognize the reality of a traumatic perception, Laplanche and Pontalis. He introduces the term in 1923 in connection with the castration complex, the traumatic perception being the site of the female genitalia. When children first discover the absence of the penis in the girl, they disavow the fact and believe that they do see a penis all the same. Freud continues to employ the term throughout the rest of his work, linking it specifically both to psychosis and to fetishism. In these clinical conditions, disavowal is always accompanied by the opposite attitude, acceptance of reality, since it is rarely or perhaps never possible for the ego's detachment from reality to be carried through completely. The coexistence in the ego of these two contradictory attitudes to reality leads to what Freud terms the splitting of the ego. See split. While Freud's use of the term is quite consistent, he does not distinguish the term rigorously from other related operations. Lacan, however, works the term into a rigorous theory, relating it and contrasting it specifically with the operations of repression and foreclosure. Whereas Freud had only linked disavowal to one form of perversion, Lacan makes it a fundamental operation in all forms of perversion. and whereas Freud had also linked disavowal with psychosis, Lacan limits disavowal exclusively to the structure of perversion. Disavowal is the fundamental operation in perversion, just as repression and foreclosure are the fundamental operations in neurosis and psychosis. Thus, in Lacan's account, disavowal is one way of responding to the castration of the big other, whereas the neurotic represses the realization of castration, the pervert disavows it. Like Freud, Lacan asserts that disavowal is always accompanied by a simultaneous acknowledgement of what is disavowed. Thus the pervert is not simply ignorant of castration, he simultaneously knows it and denies it, whereas the term disavowal originally denotes in Freud's work only one side of this operation, the side of denial. For Lacan, the term comes to denote both sides, the simultaneous denial and recognition of castration. Whereas Freud relates disavowal to the perception of the absence of the penis in women, Lacan relates it to the realization of the absence of the phallus in the big other. The traumatic perception is, in Lacan's account, the realization that the cause of desire is always a lack. It is this realization that disavowal concerns. Disavowal is the failure to accept that lack causes desire. The belief that desire is caused by a presence, for example, the fetish. Discourse, discours. Whenever Lacan uses the term discourse rather than say speech, it is in order to stress the trans-individual nature of language, the fact that speech always implies another subject, an interlocutor. Thus the famous Lacanian formula, the unconscious is the discourse of the other, which first appears in 1953 and later becomes the unconscious is the discourse of the big other, designates the unconscious as the effects on the subject of speech that is addressed to him from elsewhere, by another subject who has been forgotten, by another psychic locality, the other scene. In 1969, Lacan begins to use the term discourse in a slightly different way, though one that still carries with it a stress on intersubjectivity. From this point on, the term designates a social bond founded in language. Lacan identifies four possible types of social bond, four possible articulations of the symbolic network which regulates intersubjective relations. These four discourses are the discourse of the master, the discourse of the university, the discourse of the hysteric, and the discourse of the analyst. Lacan represents each of the four discourses by an algorithm. Each algorithm contains the following four algebraic symbols. S1 equals the master signifier, S2 equals knowledge, le savoir, S bar equals the subject, little a equals surplus enjoyment. What distinguishes the four discourses from one another is the positions of these four symbols. There are four positions in the algorithms of the four discourses, each of which is designated by a different name. The names of the four positions are shown in figure 2. Lacan gives different names to these. Above the bar, the agent. Below the bar, truth. Above the bar, the other. Below the bar, production. Figure 2, the structure of the four discourses. The names of the four positions are shown in figure 2. Lacan gives different names to these positions at different points in his work, and this figure is taken from the 1972-1973 seminar. Each discourse is defined by writing the four algebraic symbols in a different position. The symbols always remain in the same order, so each discourse is simply the result of rotating the symbols a quarter turn. The top left position, the agent, is the dominant position which defines the discourse. In addition to the four symbols, each algorithm also contains an arrow going from the agent to the other. The four discourses are shown in figure 3. In 1971, Lacan proposes that the position of the agent is also the position of semblance. In 1972, Lacan inscribes two arrows in the formulas instead of one. One arrow, which Lacan labels impossibility, goes from the agent to the other, and the other arrow, which is labeled powerlessness, goes from production to truth. The discourse of the master is the basic discourse from which the other three discourses are derived. The dominant position is occupied by the master signifier S1, which represents the subject as Bart for an other signifier, or more precisely for all other signifiers S2. However, in this signifying operation there is always a surplus, namely objet petit A. The point is that all attempts at totalization are doomed to failure. The discourse of the master masks the division of the subject. The discourse also illustrates clearly the structure of the dialectic of the master and the slave. The master S1 is the agent who puts the slave S2 to work. The result of this work is a surplus objet petit A that the master attempts to appropriate. Discourse of the master: above the bar S1, below the bar S Bart. Above the bar S2, below the bar objet petit A. Discourse of the university: above the bar S2, below the bar S1. Above the bar objet petit A, below the bar S Bart. Discourse of the hysteric: above the bar S Bart, below the bar objet petit A. Above the bar S1, below the bar S2. Discourse of the analyst: above the bar objet petit A, below the bar S2. Above the bar S Bart, below the bar S1. The discourse of the university is produced by a quarter turn of the discourse of the master, anti-clockwise. The dominant position is occupied by knowledge, savoir. This illustrates the fact that behind all attempts to impart an apparently neutral knowledge to the other can always be located an attempt at mastery of knowledge, and domination of the other to whom this knowledge is imparted. The discourse of the university represents the hegemony of knowledge, particularly visible in modernity in the form of the hegemony of science. The discourse of the hysteric is also produced by a quarter turn of the discourse of the master, but in a clockwise direction. It is not simply that which is uttered by a hysteric, but a certain kind of social bond in which any subject may be inscribed. The dominant position is occupied by the divided subject, the symptom. This discourse is that which points the way towards knowledge. Psychoanalytic treatment involves the structural introduction of the discourse of the hysteric by means of artificial conditions. In other words, the analyst hystericizes the patient's discourse. The discourse of the analyst is produced by a quarter turn of the discourse of the hysteric, in the same way as Freud developed psychoanalysis by giving an interpretative turn to the discourse of his hysterical patients. The position of the agent, which is the position occupied by the analyst in the treatment, is occupied by objet petit A. This illustrates the fact that the analyst must, in the course of the treatment, become the cause of the analysant's desire. The fact that this discourse is the inverse of the discourse of the master emphasizes that for Lacan, psychoanalysis is an essentially subversive practice which undermines all attempts at domination and mastery. For further information on the four discourses, see Blacher. Drive. Pulsion. Freud's concept of the drive, Trieb, lies at the heart of his theory of sexuality. For Freud, a distinctive feature of human sexuality as opposed to the sexual life of other animals is that it is not regulated by any instinct, a concept which implies a relatively fixed and innate relationship to an object, but by drives which differ from instincts in that they are extremely variable and develop in ways which are contingent on the life history of the subject. Lacan insists on maintaining the Freudian distinction between trieb, drive, and instinct, and criticizes James Strachey for obliterating this distinction by translating both terms as instinct in the Standard Edition. Whereas instinct denotes a mythical pre-linguistic need, the drive is completely removed from the realm of biology. The drives differ from biological needs in that they can never be satisfied, and do not aim at an object but rather circle perpetually round it. Lacan argues that the purpose of the drive, Triebziel, is not to reach a goal, a final destination, but to follow its aim, the way itself, which is to circle around the object. Thus the real purpose of the drive is not some mythical goal of full satisfaction, but to return to its circular path, and the real source of enjoyment is the repetitive movement of this closed circuit. Lacan reminds his readers that Freud defined the drive as a montage composed of 4 discontinuous elements: the pressure, the end, the object, and the source. The drive cannot therefore be conceived of as some ultimate given, something archaic, primordial. It is thoroughly cultural and symbolic construct. Lacan thus empties the concept of the drive of the lingering references in Freud's work to energetics and hydraulics. Lacan incorporates the 4 elements of the drive in his theory of the drive's circuit. In this circuit, the drive originates in an erogenous zone, circles round the object, and then returns to the erogenous zone. This circuit is structured by the 3 grammatical voices. 1. The active voice, for example, to see. 2. The reflexive voice, for example, to see oneself. 3. The passive voice, for example, to be seen. The first of these 2 times, active and reflexive voices, are autoerotic. They lack a subject. Only in the 3rd time, the passive voice, when the drive completes its circuit, does a new subject appear, which is to say that before this time there was no subject. Although the 3rd time is the passive voice, the drive is always essentially active, which is why Lacan writes the 3rd time not as to be seen, but as to make oneself be seen. Even supposedly passive phases of the drive, such as masochism, involve activity. The circuit of the drive is the only way for the subject to transgress the pleasure principle. Freud argued that sexuality is composed of a number of partial drives, Partiltrieb, such as the oral drive and the anal drive, each specified by a different source, a different erotogenic zone. At first, these component drives function anarchically and independently, vis-à-vis the polymorphous perversity of children. But in puberty, they become organized and fused together under the primacy of the genital organs. Lacan emphasizes the partial nature of all drives, but differs from Freud on 2 points. 1. Lacan rejects the idea that the partial drives can ever attain any complete organization or fusion, arguing that the primacy of the genital zone, if achieved, is always a highly precarious affair. He thus challenges the notion put forward by some psychoanalysts after Freud of a genital drive in which the partial drives are completely integrated in a harmonious fashion. 2. Lacan argues that the drives are partial, not in the sense that they are parts of a whole, a genital drive, but in the sense that they only represent sexuality partially. They do not represent the reproductive function of sexuality, but only the dimension of enjoyment. Lacan identifies 4 partial drives: the oral drive, the anal drive, the scopic drive, and the invocatory drive. Each of these drives is specified by a different partial object and a different erogenous zone, as shown in Figure 4. Figure 4. Partial drive. Capital D, oral drive, anal drive. Small d, scopic drive, invocatory drive. Erogenous zone, oral drive, lips, partial object, breast, verb to suck. Anal drive, partial drive, anal drive. Erogenous zone, anus. Partial object, feces. Verb to shit. Partial drive, scopic drive. Erogenous zone, eyes. Partial object, gaze. Verb to see. Invocatory drive, partial drive, invocatory drive. Erogenous zone, ears, partial object, voice, verb to hear. The first 2 drives relate to demand, whereas the second pair relate to desire. Demand, oral drive, anal drive, desire, scopic drive, invocatory drive. In 1957, in the context of the graph of desire, Lacan proposes the formula as Barth diamond shape capital D of demand as the matheme for the drive. This formula is to be read to Barth subject in relation to demand, the fading of the subject before the insistence of a demand that persists without any conscious intention to sustain it. Throughout the various reformulations of the drive theory in Freud's work, one constant feature is a basic dualism. At first, this dualism was conceived in terms of an opposition between the sexual drives, Sexualtriebe, on the one hand, and the ego drives, Ich-Triebe, or drives of self-preservation, Selbsterhaltungstriebe, on the other. This opposition was problematized by Freud's growing realization in the period of 1940-1920 that the ego drives are themselves sexual. He was thus led to reconceptualize the dualism of the drives in terms of an opposition between the life drives, Lebenstriebe, and the death drives, Todestriebe. Lacan argues that it is important to retain Freud's dualism and rejects the monism of Jung, who argued that all psychic forces could be reduced to one single concept of psychic energy. However, Lacan prefers to reconceptualize this dualism in terms of an opposition between the symbolic and the imaginary, and not in terms of an opposition between different kinds of drives. Thus, for Lacan, all drives are sexual drives, and every drive is a death drive, since every drive is excessive, repetitive, and ultimately destructive. The drives are closely related to desire, both originate in the field of the subject, as opposed to the genital drive, which, if it exists, finds its form on the side of the big other. However, the drive is not merely another name for desire, they are the partial aspects in which desire is realized. Desire is one and undivided, whereas the drives are partial manifestations of desire. Dual relation. Relation duel. Duality and dual relations are essential characteristics of the imaginary order. The paradigmatic dual relation is the relationship between the ego and the specular image, small object A and small object A accent, which Lacan analyzes in his concept of the mirror stage. The dual relation is always characterized by illusions of similarity, symmetry, and reciprocity. In contrast to the duality of the imaginary order, the symbolic order is characterized by triads. In the symbolic order, all relations involve not two but three terms. The third term is the big other, which mediates all imaginary dual relations. The illusion of reciprocity in the imaginary dual relationship contrasts with the symbolic, which is the realm of absolute non-reciprocity. The Oedipus complex is a paradigmatic triangular structure, since the father is introduced into the dual relation between mother and child as a third term. The Oedipal passage from a dual relation to a triangular structure is none other than the passage from the imaginary to the symbolic order. Indeed, the very concept of structure itself involves a minimum of three terms. There are always three terms in the structure. The opposition between imaginary dyads and symbolic triads is complicated by Lacan's discussion of the imaginary triad. The imaginary triad is Lacan's attempt to theorize the pre-Oedipal stage in terms other than those of a merely dual relationship, and refers to the moment preceding the Oedipus complex when a third element, the imaginary phallus, circulates between the mother and infant. When the father intervenes in the Oedipus complex, he can therefore be seen either as a third element between mother and child, or as a fourth element, in addition to the mother, child, and phallus. It is for this reason that Lacan writes that in the Oedipus complex it is not a question of a father-mother-child triangle, but of a triangle father-phallus-mother-child. One of Lacan's most frequent criticisms of the psychoanalytic theory of his day is that it constantly fails to theorize the role of the symbolic, and thus reduces the psychoanalytic encounter to an imaginary dual relationship between analyst and analysant. Lacan argues that this error lies behind a whole series of misunderstandings in psychoanalytic theory. In particular, it reduces analytic treatment to an ego-to-ego encounter, which, because of the aggressivity inherent in all imaginary dual relations, often degenerates into a fight to the death between analyst and analysant, a power struggle in which they are at daggers drawn. See Master. Against such a misconception, Lacan insists on the function of the symbolic in the analytic process, which introduces the big other as a third term in the analytic encounter. It is within a three rather than two-term relation that we have to formulate the analytic experience. Rather than seeing the treatment as a power struggle in which the analyst must overcome the patient's resistance, which is not psychoanalysis, but suggestion, the analyst must realize that both he and the patient are equally subjected to the power of a third term, language itself. Lacan's rejection of duality can also be seen in his rejection of all dualistic schemes of thought in favor of triadic schemes. All two-sided relationships are always stamped with the style of the imaginary. For example, instead of the traditional binary opposition between what is real and what is imaginary, Lacan proposes the tripartite model of real, imaginary, and symbolic. Other such triadic schemes are the three clinical structures of neurosis, psychosis, and perversion. The three formations of the ego, ego-ideal, ideal-ego, and superego. The triad nature, culture, society, etc. However, as if to counteract this trend, Lacan also emphasized the importance of schemes involving four elements. See quaternary.